Hi, I'm Christopher Wolf of the Thomas International Center, and this afternoon we're fortunate to have the opportunity to have a conversation with Mary Eberstadt, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., a former Managing Editor of the Public Interest and Executive Editor of the National Interest and Consulting Editor to Policy Review. Author of many interesting articles, frequent contributor to fine journals and newspapers, and also author more recently of two books, The Loser Letters, a comic tale of life, death, and atheism, and another book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. So welcome, Mary. It's really great to have you today.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
As I usually do in these interviews, let's start a little bit with your intellectual autobiography. You know, when you started thinking about interesting things, where did you start? Where did you come from?
Well, thank you. I think in college, which in my case was Cornell, there was one formative influence. I was there in the early 1980s, and as far as religion was concerned, it was essentially a wasteland. However, there was a wonderful philosopher named Norman Kretzmann. The late Norman Kretzmann was one of the world's great medievalists. And one thing about him that was unique was that he was an agnostic. He was an agnostic on a campus full of atheists. And the mere fact that someone as intelligent as he was could entertain the idea of theism in any variety got me thinking. So following that, I went into journalism instead of going to philosophy graduate school. And in journalism, I was able to meet a number of very interesting minds, some of the best people writing in these areas of philosophy and religion today, like Michael Novak and Irving Kristol, also the late Irving Kristol, and many other people who have been formative influences, whether they wanted to be or not.
How did Kristol influence you? I mean, he's certainly a remarkable man, a great writer, and you knew him pretty well for a long time.
Well, he's the reason I didn't go to graduate school. I took a year off after college, and I thought I'd move to New York and see if I could be a writer, and fortunately got a job with Irving Kristol, who was then already legendary because of the apprenticeships that he was running out of the Public Interest magazine, and a number of people whose names you would know and viewers would know graduated from his system of apprenticeship. He was a fantastic mind. He was an avuncular figure. He was the kind of mentor I think is seriously lacking in the world today, and that's part of why he was as influential as he was.
So where'd you go from there, from the publication world, the publishing world?
I did a couple of stints ghostwriting, one for Jean Kirkpatrick, our ambassador to the United Nations during the Reagan years, and on account of working for her, I ended up in Washington as a speechwriter to the Secretary of State, George Shultz, also under President Reagan, and spent almost 2 years doing that, and then took a long vacation to get married and raise a few children.
That's great. And then, let's see, you went to the Hoover Institution eventually, and now to EPTC.
Eventually, I got a part-time appointment with the Hoover Institution, and its magazine Policy Review, which was edited by a friend of mine, Todd Lindbergh, who has also been a collaborator over the years. And during that time, I started writing essays, and you'll appreciate this. Once our youngest was old enough to go to school, suddenly the writing increased, mysteriously enough. And I started writing for First Things and the Weekly Standard and places like that, and eventually this led to book writing.
What are some of your favorite articles over the years, the ones that you want our viewers to go back and dig out on the internet to take a look at?
Well, thank you. I don't know about my favorite, but among the more notorious ones, I guess, one was an essay called Eminem is Right, which was a countercultural idea, and the idea was that if you sit down and listen to contemporary music, rap music, rock music, and all this kind of stuff that we parents can hardly bear to listen to, what you actually hear is the language of broken homes. And the much hated by parents figure Eminem is emblematic of this. This is music about what it's like to grow up without a father. It's music about what it's like to lose a family and to grow up with dysfunction. It's music of the post-sexual revolution, essentially. So there's a lot out there that emanates from the popular culture, I think, that tells us what people are going through, and it gives us a certain kind of empirical evidence about the fallout of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the sexual revolution. I guess I have to show people your book, Adam and Eve After the Pill, Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. A wonderful piece. I know so many students who have read this and said, it's such a great book. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of it, how you came to write that book?
Thank you. Yes, I had mostly been writing for the secular media, as mentioned, and then I had the experience in 2008 of reading Humanae Vitae for the first time. This is, of course, the encyclical banning contraception, 1968. It was terribly, terribly notorious.
I want to mention the background to how you actually read it, because you told that story
well,
earlier.
The real story is that a friend of mine, Joseph Bottom, the poet and essayist, had taken over the magazine First Things, and he asked me if I would write articles for him, and I said sure, and he said, well, do you have anything in mind? And I actually didn't. But I wanted to, because I wanted to write something and get paid, which is the sort of motivation that leads to most writing in the world. And I thought, well, it's 2008, it's the 40th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, maybe I can do something about that. And I had the idea of a simple retrospective. Since I had never read Humanae Vitae before, I had no idea how formative would be the experience of sitting down and going through that document. It's a remarkable document. As you know, it's probably the most hated document of the last 50 years. Certainly on the global stage, it's hard to think of anything more mocked and unwanted than the Church's prohibition on birth control. But the thing is, that document is also probably the most prophetic document of the last 50 years, because it laid out very clearly what the world would look like after the sexual revolution in a way that nobody else came close to. And what I ended up doing was documenting with perfectly secular sources from the popular culture, the expert culture, medical journals, etc., that the fundamental predictions of Humanae Vitae had come true, that the Catholic Church got no credit for this, and that there was a great paradox surrounding this document, which was at once the most prophetic and also the most reviled of living memory.
You want to talk about some of those prophecies and how you think they've worked out?
Well, for one thing, the document predicted that coercive contraceptive technology would be used coercively by coercive governments. And at the time, no one else was saying this. Everyone saw these technologies as liberating. But since the document was written, we've had the experience of the one-child policy in China. We've seen these technologies used coercively in India and elsewhere, as mentioned in my book. We've seen secular social science vindicate the idea that there is no overpopulation problem in the first place, which was supposed to be the problem in whose name this technology was being deployed. So that's just one set of predictions that Humanae Vitae got right, that other people were not taking seriously at the time. And then there were all the predictions about what would happen to relations between the sexes once these kinds of technologies became prevalent. Humanae Vitae predicted that contraception on a mass scale would create new romantic problems. It would that they would lower the respect in which men hold women. Now, in my book, I march through, again, the vindication of these prophecies using secular evidence, like, for example, the evidence of women talking themselves about how men don't respect them anymore, like quoting from fashionable magazines and lifestyle pieces about what it's like to be a modern woman. In all kinds of ways, and I'm leaving aside the social science evidence for the moment, I think what's going on around us vindicates the predictions of Humanae Vitae, and I try and go through that systematically in the book.
Yeah. It's enough to make you ask, how did we get into this situation where we have such serious problems in so many ways? You referred elliptically there to the demographic implosion that we're facing right now, where it's not a problem of excessive population, but a problem of declining population and the various kinds of problems that are associated with that. And then, of course, as you say, the whole question of the relationship between men and women these days is fraught with not just uncertainty, but also with angst, with sometimes bitterness. You know, it's interesting. We've talked before about the series of articles by women in the Atlantic over the last few years, and how striking it is that these essays are, while they ultimately, you know, accept that modern lifestyle, are not essays that sound like they're written by happy people.
No, not at all, Chris. And if you listen closely to what these women are saying, and I think it's important to do so, what you hear is that they find men to be unreliable, that increasingly they're turning their backs on marriage and just deciding to go it alone, that this happens to such an extent that some of them are having children with anonymous sperm donors as fathers, thus creating the first class of purposely fatherless children. It's an astonishing thing by historical standards. That's how much these people have given up on life. And you have to ask yourself if this is really the language of liberation, because I don't think it is. This is the language of defeatism. This is not the kind of language that Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Helen Gurley Brown and other liberationists thought they would hear at the end of the day, but it is what we are hearing, and that tells us something important. It tells us that things have gone wrong.
And one of the striking things I think about the difference between, let's say, the atmosphere at the time of Humanae Vitae and today is, when you put yourself back at the time of Humanae Vitae, the whole tone of the discussion was that this newly available technology of contraception was going to really usher in an era in which marriage was going to flourish, because, you know, the old tensions that arose from the difficulties of having too many children or the difficulties of foregoing sex in order to avoid having children, that could be put to rest, and we now have a time when, you know, there was a better relationship between husbands and wives that would cause a flourishing of marriage. And that looks so almost quaint now as you look back, and over the course of the years you see that Pope Paul's, you know, prediction that it was going to lead to growing divorce was, if anything, an understatement, that there has been a tremendous assault on marriage over time, and in ways that are really disconcerting to a lot of young people today, because they see the problem.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to go there and to understand that if you looked at the predictions made by the liberationists at that time and you compare them to those of Humanae Vitae, you see that the liberationists lose this fight. They really, really do. I don't think anybody would claim that there hasn't been an increase in broken homes, for example, an increase in divorce and out-of-wedlock births. It's impossible to claim that without being refuted by the empirical evidence. And yet that's what people thought. People thought, who were defending contraception, that they would see these better outcomes, stronger marriages, as you say. It isn't what happened. And, you know, one of the other ironies is that if you question contraception as a social fact, these days, you run the risk of being run out of town as a laughingstock. People think you're trying to put them back in the Stone Age. But the evidence is not on the side of the people who were advocating this. And it's important to stick to that point historically, because that is the historically defensible point.
You're not as pessimistic as some people are about whether or not there's a possibility for change here. What gives you some hope that there might be a change in this culture at which contraception seems to be in the center?
Well, a couple of things, Chris. One is a general intellectual point. As the historian Karl Popper showed very brilliantly in The Poverty of Historicism, history itself is not on the side of movements that claim inevitability for themselves. You can think of movements that claimed inevitability for themselves, that announced they were here to stay and that there would never be a change. Communism was one of them, and outside of North Korea and parts of Cuba, I don't think you'd find a lot of people to defend the idea that communism is the wave of the future anymore. So that was one rather major movement. that said there was no turning back the clock on it that turned out to be wrong. More prosaically, an example I love to talk about, let's talk about tobacco smoking. Now, 50 years ago, tobacco smoking was ubiquitous. Beyond 50 years ago, it was ubiquitous. I can remember as a child seeing people smoke in hospital rooms, which I think would be shocking to anybody under the age of, say, 40.
It's actually funny going back and watching movies from the 50s where people are smoking left and right, men and women. It's just, part of the culture of the time.
Exactly. It was part of the wallpaper. You could smoke on airplanes. You could smoke pretty much everywhere. Now, I'm not saying this to demonize smokers, far from it. I'm bringing up this point for a reason, because 50 years ago, if anything looked inevitable, it would be that tobacco smoking was here to stay, and that the minority of people who objected to it were just plumb out of luck because there was no turning back the clock on this particular habit. What do we see 50 years later? Well, what we see is something that I think nobody would have predicted 50 years ago. There's been a massive transformation in the way the Western world views smoking, not only in the United States, but across Europe. Once it would have been unthinkable that you couldn't smoke in an Irish pub, but that's where we are now. Once, not very long ago, it would have been unthinkable that you couldn't smoke anywhere you pleased in New York City. But look what the mayor has managed to do there. In other words, we've seen a widespread social phenomenon, tobacco smoking, widespread not only in America, not only in the West, but across the world. And we have seen this behavior circumscribed, stigmatized. We've seen a real sea change in how most of the world views this activity. To me, that proves that there is such a thing as genies going back into bottles. And that's why I like to make the analogy between tobacco smoking and pornography, tobacco smoking and the sexual revolution. Because generally, Chris, I think whenever you hear the phrase, there's no turning back the clock, it's being said by people who are protesting too much and who know that inevitability is not on their side.
Well, that raises the interesting question of how such a change might occur. What's going to happen that would bring about the change? What forces do you think are going to bring about a change in this respect?
Well, I think, as with the example of smoking, it's partly that we're starting to see the fallout of the sexual revolution in a way that wasn't obvious 50 years ago when all this started. And I'm not demonizing the people who started it. A lot of people thought, as you pointed out, that it would make things better, that it would liberate people. It hasn't turned out that way. But what has turned out is that a lot of people now are aware of the fallout. You have a lot of young adults who have grown up in broken homes. You have a lot of people, children and older, who know what it's like to live without a father, who know what it's like to be brought up in shared custody. Now, again, the point of saying that is not to demonize those folks. It's just to say that the sad fallout of this great social experiment has now trickled down to many millions of people. And you have to figure that somewhere in there is the makings of a backlash. I think we're already seeing it to some extent. We're seeing it, for example, in Catholic and other Christian renewal movements, especially on campus. There are all kinds of vibrant, back to traditionalism sort of student groups and other groups of young adults that didn't exist 50 years ago and that have grown up partly directly in response to this kind of negative fallout of the sexual revolution. So bit by bit, I think we can see the makings of a new future, at least among the people in that counterculture.
One of the things we talked about earlier between us was that part of this change is not going to be through just intellectual argumentation, but through perhaps more imaginative expressions or representations of important social and philosophical principles. And in that regard, I guess we can bring to the attention of viewers the loser letters. Tell us a little bit about the loser letters.
Thank you, Chris. That is the only work of fiction I've done, and it was done for the reason that in response to the new atheism and the popularity of new atheist thinking, I was trying to find a way of talking about all that would bypass the usual theological and intellectual journals. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but in particular when it comes to reaching younger people, young adults, especially in a culture that is de-Christianizing, which I think most of us would agree the West is, you have to find a way of communicating that is beyond the traditional. And storytelling from time immemorial has been one of those ways. And so in the Loser Letters, I tell the story of a girl, a 20-something troubled girl, who's in rehab and writing letters to the new atheists, talking about what she loves about atheism. In the course of this book, her own story comes out, and her story is a typical story that I think resonates with many young people who read it. The reason for telling the story that way is that there are people who would never pick up, say, Christianity Today or one of the Catholic magazines or newspapers, who really think that they're beyond all that, who really think that Christianity has been left on the dust heap of history. But those people still resonate to a story, especially about troubled people like themselves. So in bringing theological and religious content into this story, I was trying to communicate with especially 20-somethings in a way that I think we need to do more of.
Are there other things you can tell us about the books without spoiling it for the readers who are going to run out and get a copy?
Thanks, Chris. No flipping ahead to the end. There's a surprise ending. And although the book was loosely inspired by C.S. Lewis and the Screwtape Letters, I mean to emphasize the loosely. It was inspired by the Screwtape Letters in the sense that this is a pro-religious satire that's told through a series of letters. But there the resemblance ends, because my protagonist, unlike any of C.S. Lewis's, is living through a profoundly de-Christianizing time. And the language that his characters were able to enjoy isn't even in her vocabulary. So we're talking about this kind of blasted, I like to say de-Christianizing instead of post-Christian, because post-Christian sort of presupposes the ending of all of this. But she's living through a time when religious illiteracy has reached such a level that her story can only be told through references in the popular culture. So this is the language of Facebook, it's the language of Instagram, which isn't language but pictures, but it's the language of all the kind of seaweed that young adults now swim in, thanks in part to the internet.
So parents and grandparents, you're going to want to run out and get a hold of a copy of the Loser Letters from Ignatius Press and perhaps give them to your children and grandchildren. We're trying to figure out these days, those of us who adhere to a more traditional or perennial philosophy, how exactly we can bring about change in society. And it's a really tall order given the domination of culture producing institutions in our society by those who adopt a more modern philosophy of expressive individualism, as some people call it, or a kind of liberationist philosophy. Given the control over Hollywood, New York, and many elite institutions, what do you think are the ways that we can actually bring about change in society?
I think it's important to look at this as a grassroots problem. That it's important to work on the campuses. There are lots of them, and every place there's a campus, there are open minds, at least in my experience. Even people in their late teens and early 20s who think they've shut their ears to everything haven't really. They're still easier to reach than older people who are more hardened in their ways.
Often they've never heard the other side in their life, and so it has a kind of novelty that makes it interesting to them when they hear all of a sudden an articulate presentation of a rather traditional philosophy. I think John Paul II and his impact on young people is an example of that.
Absolutely. Young people are not afraid of the radical. And a lot of what you're asked to believe, if you're doctrinally traditional, is radical stuff. And that's why I think they're more receptive to it. So I believe in starting on the campuses, for one thing. There's a lot of unused spiritual and intellectual real estate out there in that sense. And trying just in general to think of going from the ground up, from starting with small circles of people who you can then put together into a bigger movement, because I think that's more likely to succeed than something hugely ambitious that intends to change the culture from the top down.
Yeah, I guess we both think of the pro-life movement that way, that so much of the strength of the pro-life movement has been at the grassroots. And especially, I mean, we're talking about, housewives who have been able to keep abortion a live issue in our society in the face of elites that just want it to go away. And that's been really quite a tremendous accomplishment for them to be able to do that with the help of modern technology like sonograms and with the help of battles over things like partial birth abortion.
Yes, and this is an interesting fact too, Chris, that social science documents exhaustively, that although young people are more likely to be socially liberal, or I would say laissez-faire, about a lot of personal issues, gay marriage, other things, contraception, they are at the same time more likely than their parents were to be pro-life. Now this is a very interesting fact, because this is another one of those instances where there were people who said this would never be changed. There were people who thought after Roe versus Wade that anybody who was still kicking and screaming about this would just go away eventually, and the liberationists would carry the day, and 50 years later everybody would be more reasonable about these things. This is not what has happened. The opposite has happened, and it's happened in this case because of technology. Because once sonography was introduced to the scene, it became harder and harder for kids whose first experience of a sonogram was seeing their baby sister on it to then turn around and be okay with abortion. So here we have another example of a genie that does seem to be going back into the bottle bit by bit, incrementally, admittedly, but definitely more toward the bottle than out of it at this point.
Mm-hmm. So what are your future plans for writing? Are there other topics that are on your mind that you plan to write about?
Oh, thank you for asking. I've been obsessed for years with the whole puzzle of secularization. First, whether secularization exists. There's a big fight about that among the experts, both religious and secular. And second, if it does exist, what causes it? What really causes it? You know, there were great titans of modernity, Auguste Comte and Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud and others, who said that secularization was inevitable, that little by little religiosity would go over the cliff as people became more rational, more enlightened, more affluent, etc. They envisioned religion, and especially Christianity, going in a straight line down. Now, this is not what's happened. Christianity doesn't go down in a straight line. It instead waxes and wanes, and if you look at the historical record, you will see boomlets of religiosity. Example, Victorian England. Another example, very important example, after World War II, you have a renaissance, a flourishing of Christianity, not only in the United States, but again across the Western world, in Canada, in Australia, in Germany, in Great Britain, etc. So the fact that it goes up and down suggests that there's more going on in the explanation for secularization than the great modernists have understood so far. And this is the puzzle that fascinates me, and I will have a book out on that shortly, in which case I hope I can come back and tell you more about it.
We'll be looking forward to it, Mary.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much for tuning in today. This is Chris Wolf of the Thomas International Center. We've had a delightful conversation with Mary Eberstadt, Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and we look forward to seeing you again with another interview with another fascinating person. Take care.